In this series of conversations, we'll be discussing global food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental and cultural challenges facing our society, and creative ideas on how to address them. I'm Ash Sweeting, and welcome to The Ash Cloud. Today we are joined by Tim Prewitt from the Hunger Project, where his team is working with local communities across Africa, South Asia and Latin America to help millions of people end their own hunger and poverty. The recent spikes in global food and fuel prices have shown how fragile our food systems are, especially for the almost half of the world's population who are living on less than $6 a day.
People are just being forced to buy less food. So I think honestly we're at the tip of the iceberg on where this is going. We could point to Ukraine and Russia. That is, of course, one of the world's bread baskets, but there's bigger issues at play, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's a host of factors. It's everything from climate change, where we're seeing yields going down. We're seeing water resources becoming more intermittent and volatile and uncertain. And then we're seeing the rise of fuel. Of course, that's related to Russia and Ukraine also. But the rise of fuel just increases price everywhere, even for countries that don't do any imports of food.
The whole system needs to be considered.
We need to decouple the price of food from the price of fuel. And the only way to do that is to grow more locally. That's all there is to it. If you're buying grain and it's got to come all the way from Russia and you live in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's a long way for that grain to travel. It is solely dependent upon the price of fuel. And so the more we can decouple those two, the better. Simple answer, grow more local. That's oversimplifying it. And you know what? You still have to import the fertilizer.
The potential for organic farming is complex.
A lot of people are saying, let's use this moment to push people to more organics. And I think that's great. I think that's going to happen naturally. I don't think it's going to be a happy tale, though, of yay organics. I think it's going to be like, yeah, we're desperate. We're going to have to go to more organics. And here's the result. I do not think this is going to be a big success story for organics. I think it's going to be a shift because there's no other option.
Regenerative agriculture is promising, but how can it be scaled?
Scaling regenerative agriculture is tricky business for a number of reasons. One, all land is different. It has got different characteristics. Even within the same agroecological zone, it's going to behave a little bit different. You got to look to see where the water resources are, what the temperatures are, how the plants are growing. There's so many different variables. And to make a working farm, it's part art, part science.
Nutrition continues to play a secondary role.
When you look at food systems around the world and you say, okay, 8 billion people, what does this planet eat? And you look at the majority of the diet. What is the majority of the calories going in? It's wheat, it's rice, corn, sugar, and tubers. Those are the big five. And nutritionally, there's not a lot there. All those foods I just mentioned are the most heavily subsidized foods on earth. We pour billions of dollars in the US, and other countries are not much different to subsidize these crops. And meanwhile, the subsidies to vegetables are almost none.
When it comes to biodiversity, our eyes are frequently closed.
There are something like 14,000 varieties of corn. And most of those varieties are grown on indigenous lands. And we only work with like a handful of varieties. And we're obsessed with like just getting the perfect food. And the biodiversity that's out there in the world still, a lot of it rests in indigenous lands.
Economic signals are one of the most powerful tools we have.
I think if there could be one change to our food systems, I think we have to figure out a way to subsidize the production of healthy, nutritious food that's grown in a regenerative way. We've only started to scratch the surface of that. So in spite of all we know about this subject, we keep subsidizing grains to this massive level.
Tim, thank you very much for joining me today. If you could let us know a bit about what you're doing at the Hunger Project and where you're working and what you see as the biggest priorities.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ash. Really great to be here on the podcast. I am president and CEO of something called the Hunger Project. Hunger Project began in 1977 by a group of committed individuals that thought they could take charge and end hunger around the world. And that's a dream we have yet to realize, but are still, in fact, more than ever, deeply committed to. Hunger in all forms, but especially malnourishment, chronic hunger, malnutrition. And the biggest pressing issues of the day, well, I think we're all watching these food prices rise. Fuel's rising, food prices are rising, and that is putting billions at risk. I mean, if you look at the numbers of people that live on just $5 a day, and you realize what a substantial increase, depends on how you calculate it. I mean, wheat has gone up by 70%. Food in general is more on the 20 to 30% mark worldwide, I think, if you were to aggregate that. But either way, people are just being forced to buy less food. So I think honestly we're at the tip of the iceberg on where this is going. We could point to Ukraine and Russia. That is, of course, one of the world's breadbaskets, but there's bigger issues at play, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, sadly.
So many fascinating points there in terms of where to go next. You've left me with lots of questions. I think is back on the Russia and Ukraine side of things. Has that just been the spark that has set off what was already a very, very fragile situation, and it was a tinderbox waiting for a spark, and that's all that was needed was the spark?
Yeah, I think you're onto something with that, because when you look at the world's food supplies and you say Ukraine, Russia are one of 6, maybe 7 big agricultural production areas that do that huge amount of export of grains around the world. And you look at the total quantities of food we're producing every day, it shouldn't be that big of a deal, maybe. And really it's a host of factors. It's everything from climate change, where we're seeing yields going down. We're seeing water resources becoming more intermittent and volatile and uncertain. And then we're seeing the rise of fuel. Of course, that's related to Russia and Ukraine also. But the rise of fuel just increases price everywhere, even for countries that don't do any imports of food. The rise of prices, the rise of fuel price just has an exponential effect on the entire food system. But I think also people, countries panic. They say, okay, well, now, in Ukraine and Russia, they can't export the wheat. They can't get it out. The train gauge is different and the ports are blocked and they just can't easily get that food out. So then they panic. And Egypt, for example, immediately guaranteed price of wheat for all their country. And then so they're playing a game with the markets where they're going to buy wheat at any cost and make sure their people don't go without wheat, because they suffered so much during those riots and the Arab Spring in 2009 after the price went up the last round. You see Malaysia and put a ban on exports of oil, which is just insane. Like it just doesn't make any sense for a lot of reasons. India also. India, of course, have their own population to look out for, but that panic, that kind of global panic, just drives up prices further and makes countries that have food reserves, that have the extra cash lying around to withstand this, they're doing fine. It's the poorest countries, as usual, that will take the heaviest hit.
You've mentioned uh, increase in the price of fuel a number of times. There's also been significant increases in the price of fertilizer, especially nitrogen fertilizer. How do you see? Obviously, they're linked through the the Bosch process that manufactures fertilizer.
Yeah.
How do you see the impact of fertilizer compared to the impact of fuel?
Well, I was in Ghana about a month ago, and already they had their bags of fertilizer. Once it got to the local market, once, transportation obviously depended upon a lot of fuel there too. The price of fertilizer went up 3 times. And in Malawi, it was a little bit less, but it was similar. So you're seeing these countries that don't produce fertilizer, that are really dependent upon it. I mean, those farmers are just going to buy less fertilizer. They're gonna see how far they can stretch their farming with little or no commercial fertilizer. So we know that this crisis is going to last through 2024. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the impact on yield is really hard to calculate. But we know that if you were to remove all synthetic fertilizers, your yield would be around 20% of what it is. So I think the next 2 harvests are absolutely critical. And if we can't get, I mean, I would love to turn the world organic. A lot of people are saying, let's use this moment to push people to more organics. And I think that's great. I think that's going to happen naturally. I don't think it's going to be a happy tale, though, of yay organics. I think it's going to be like, yeah, we're desperate. We're going to have to go to more organics. And here's the result. I do not think this is going to be a big success story for organics. I think it's going to be a shift because there's no other option.
So, where do you see the opportunities? Because I saw a graph recently that looked at the variation of price of wheat essentially over the last few months since the Russian war, and then it also, which obviously spiked significantly, and then it also looked at the availability of wheat and how much was actually out there, and that was much flatter. So as you mentioned before, the price is so much more volatile than the supply.
Absolutely.
So where are there opportunities to relink the availability and the price, and I guess create resilience so that one geopolitical event doesn't put a spark to a tinderbox?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, food reserves help tremendously. And that's at 2 levels. One is at the national level. You have these massive warehouses of food. Countries like India do very well with that. We do well with that here in the States. But so many countries either have limited food reserves or just very, very little relative to the size of their populations. So that's one thing. They don't have anything to fall back on. The second thing is that you can also look at food reserves at the community level, where communities can practice even basic arbitrage by holding on to the grains while the price goes up. And too few communities do that, even though the technology is there to store grains safely and the knowledge is there in general, but we don't have the organization. We don't have the kind of social infrastructure that has those communities doing that. We do that at the Hunger Project, and the communities that do that, they're just so much more resilient than the communities that are around them that aren't doing that work. It's important stuff. But I think, the larger question, we need to decouple the price of food from the price of fuel. And the only way to do that is to grow more locally. That's all there is to it. If you're buying grain and it's got to come all the way from Russia and you live in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's a long way for that grain to travel. It is solely dependent upon the price of fuel. And so the more we can decouple those two, the better. Simple answer, grow more local. That's oversimplifying it. And you know what? You still have to import the fertilizer, right? So you got to get the fertilizer in country too. It's not as easy as said, but it is something to strive for. I also think that there's a lot to be said, especially now in this wake of, looking at our planet and saying, okay, we've got these miracle grains, the wheats and the corn that can be stored and transported, and they're, made into food very easily. They're great miracle crops, and they've kind of fueled us to growing the population of the planet to 8 billion. I think, though, if you look ahead 40, 50 years from now, we're simply not going to have any soils left. We can't keep farming the way we do. We can't keep putting down the fertilizer, the pesticides, all the rest of it. We're burning up our soils. I mean, some of the estimates say that we've already consumed about half the world's topsoils, and the other half will be gone within 50 years. So then we have to say, okay, well, how are we going to grow food that's in harmony with the planet, that's still capable of feeding this enormously populated planet? And there's a lot of interest. One of our board members is working on the research on indigenous crops in West Africa, crops like fonio or teff in Ethiopia. Teff in particular, the micronutrient content of teff is just outstanding. It does really well in drought conditions. It's incredibly durable. Hectare per hectare, it converts into nutritious food better than any wheat or corn or any of these other grains. So I think we need to look at agriculture differently. We need to say, how are we going to grow in harmony with the land? And also, how can we grow the most nutritious crops per hectare and per water and energy resources?
Once again, so many fascinating points. And just to take a little bit of a step back for a second, for those people who haven't been, because you work operating in sub-Saharan Africa and also parts of Asia, for people who haven't actually been on a farm in those situations, you mentioned earlier the projects the projects you were doing at the Hunger Project, and how you created resilience through increased local production, improved storage, etc. Could you just quickly walk us through what that looks like?
Sure. Yeah. I think I'll give you an example. I was in Uganda not too long ago, and I went to a community member's house. Her name was Farida, and she had this, she was really proud of her work. She had a small agribusiness processing pumpkin and a few other crops. So she would dry the pumpkin, solar drying, and grind it up and have like a pumpkin powder that she would sell in a bag, a simple plastic bag. And it was pumpkin porridge. So she made me a cup, this like little cup, and just poured hot water on her ground pumpkin. And you're drinking this pumpkin porridge, really nutritious, really tasty, very tasty. And she was selling quite a bit of it to her neighbors. And then she took me back to her farm, and it doesn't look like any farm we'd see in the US, where all the, everything's in perfect rows and all the crops are the same height, all the plants are the same height. And, it's just that kind of beautiful symmetrical farm. Instead, this looked more like kind of a kitchen garden. There were trees, first of all, covering the plants, trees around. Some were like cocoa trees. Other were things like okra. There was all sorts of vegetables. There were, of course, pumpkins and some melons. There was papaya and mango trees. There was also corn and soya, but again, it wasn't in these neat rows. It was all kind of growing together. And as I walked down, it was sloped, and I walked down the hill of this garden, and you could see how the plants were kind of working together. The nutrients in the soil were maintained by the roots of the trees, and the food that was growing there was much more sustainable. It's a garden that will probably look the same year in, year out, and can maintain that level of productivity for a long time. If you compare that to the land where we have to put down a lot of fertilizer and chemicals, you're just always fighting with the soil. You're always trying to get the nutrients back into the soil so the plants can absorb it. It's just a much different type of farming. The yields are much lower on the kind of natural garden farm, but nevertheless, it's the way to go. And she was feeding her family and several others around her by using these farming methods.
So I love what you're saying about the plants collaborating, working together with the soil. But the big question, and as myself sitting here in Northern California, when you mention that to the Silicon Valley types, the first question they're going to ask is, how's it going to scale?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I tell you, you know this better than I do, Ash. I mean, the scaling regenerative agriculture is tricky business for a number of reasons. One, all land is different. It has got different characteristics. Even within the same agroecological zone, it's going to behave a little bit different. You got to look to see where the water resources are, what the temperatures are, how the plants are growing. There's so many different variables. And to make a working farm, it's part art, part science, and it's difficult to scale. I think it's sad to say, but us humans have to get back to that kind of regenerative agriculture. As labor intensive as it is, we have to do a lot more of it. Now, when you look at the organic movement in the US, you do have signs that it can grow to bigger and bigger scale. Of course, that doesn't preserve the soil. That's not nearly as in harmony with the earth as regenerative agriculture. But I do think combining some of the techniques from the organics movement, if you will, with regenerative agriculture practices, I think that's a glimpse at scale that we've only just begun to tap.
Okay, thank you. I had another two question. It was on the tip of my tongue. Give me a second. What about when it comes? So I think from what you just said, that a lot of industrial agriculture has focused on relatively simple solutions to complex problems. So you've got a pest ecosystem where there's dozens or hundreds of species, one of which is negative. So you throw on a herbicide that kills all of them. You have a nutrient deficiency, and you'll get a very big hit by hitting on some NPK.
Yeah.
The fact that plants need multiple nutrients, like a dozen or 2 dozen nutrients to actually grow, plus a dynamic soil microbiome. Where do you see the future of, I guess, simple solutions to complex problems?
I do think there's a lot more research going in the right direction on basically crop technology. And I think GMOs, it's such a bad rap from certain groups that said, okay, GMOs you're treating food as intellectual. Let's leave out the human, the potential for human health, right? Let's leave that off the table for now. I haven't seen any good research on that, but there are claims that it negatively impacts human health. Let's take that off the table for a second. There are a lot of people that say, okay, food is intellectual property. You're getting these seeds that are manufactured by big companies, and the secret to their business model is that they want to sell you these seeds they're going to sell you the seeds every year, and they have to sell you the crop protection products to go with, or a partner company does. And so you're locked into this kind of agro-industrial model. I could be wrong. I hope I'm not. But what I see is an opening up of that. You're seeing more CRISPR technology, which is a little more open sourced. You're seeing the big guys working on drought resistant crops and crops that don't need all of the crop protection products. So I think if technology is to save the day here, like it's done so many times in history with agriculture, I think it's around more open source technology around the seeds, less need for fertilizer, less need for crop protection products. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a soil scientist nor an agronomist, but my understanding is that that's pretty hard to do. It's not easy to replicate the protection of the crop from insects, or the ability for crops to grow magically without nutrients in the soil. I think that's more difficult to do. At least I understand. But anything in that direction gives me hope that somehow we're going to figure out a simple solution. Otherwise, going to regenerative agriculture, I mean, you said it. I mean, scale. What about scale? And I think it's not it's maybe impossible. I don't know. It may be impossible to do regenerative agriculture for 8 billion people, I would think, based on our land resources right now. This is Whole Foods, right? I mean, I love champagne socialism, or whatever they say, with the vine ripened tomatoes. It's all very delicious. But only a certain percentage of the population can eat that way, not only for economic reasons, but also for land resources, water resources.
I guess a couple of things from that are you actually collaborating with any researchers in terms of working together to develop solutions? And also, I'll go for that one first.
We are so committed to the community side of this, to the farms in Uganda, like Farida's farm, to women leaders in India that are working in their own villages to solve food security problems. That's kind of our specialty at the Hunger Project, more so than the ag tech side. But that said, we just had a collaboration with Again University on looking at the implications from Ukraine. And we are working with especially governmental agencies overseas. For example, with the Ugandan government, we worked on seed development. So we tend to work, again, mostly at, we're 27 people in New York and 400 people worldwide. So you get a sense of our staffing. So we're very much focused on Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and Mexico too, and Peru.
Mm-hmm. And back to the research, is there any particular area that you see as the most exciting from a personal perspective?
Well, I know just enough about this to be excited about it. So it probably means if I were to look carefully, it wouldn't be as exciting. So let me just share it anyways. I honestly think the ocean is probably the biggest untapped resources for food. And especially the small stuff, the seaweeds and the algae and the planktons and all the rest. I don't know. We've tried this the big salmon fisheries in Norway and Chile and elsewhere. These are really harmful to the environment. It's good to get cheap salmon, but they are really harmful to the environment. So I think there's a way to work with the oceans more sustainably that's interesting.
And it's interesting you mentioned some of these ocean, the planktons, the seaweeds, etc., because they have a different nutrient profile than a lot of the staples. The
completely different,
etc. So yep. Because we eat to provide nutrients to ourselves. So on that note, how do you see the balance between hunger in the areas where you're working based on purely a calorific issue compared to a more nutrient efficiency challenge?
That's a great question. I mean, so often when you look at food systems around the world and you say, okay, 8 billion people, what does this planet eat? and you look at the majority of the diet, what is the majority of the calories going in? It's wheat, it's rice, corn, sugar, and tubers. Those are the big five. And nutritionally, there's not a lot there. They certainly provide the macro calories that we need to fuel our day, but they don't provide, there's so much missing from that. And it's the micronutrients in particular that are at a real loss with that. So without getting into the seaweed question, I think you're right. We're land-based animals. We're used to, right? We need the soils. We need to eat the food that comes from soils. I think that's absolutely right. But at the same time, like I don't know. I just there's so much inefficiency and waste. And I guess when you look at it from that perspective, the hunger we see, it's based on so much inefficiency in what kinds of food we're producing. And the reality is that the easiest stuff to store and ship and process, that's what we're working with. And it's also the foods that have been subsidized. I mean, all those foods I just mentioned are the most heavily subsidized foods on earth. We pour billions of dollars in the US, and other countries are not much different, to subsidize these crops. And meanwhile, the subsidies to vegetables are almost none.
So it's like the logistics components are driving the food system rather than the nutrient requirements of humans.
Absolutely. And storage and processing. I mean, the vegetables they're just hard to move around compared to wheat and corn, right? They're just a lot fussier. They go off, you got to eat, you got to sell them within 3 days. I mean, there's so many logistical challenges with vegetables that you can't think about the scale in the same way you can do with the grains and sugar and tubers. Tubers less so, but tubers are more a backyard thing. The planet is eating those tubers, though.
So back to the work you're doing at the Hunter Project and the communities you're working with in Africa and Asia, how do you work within that balance between the commodity crops, the grains, the vegetables, and then also any potential animal integration into those systems?
Yeah. Well, animal assets are huge for people living in poverty. If they can get a hold of an animal asset, it just makes their lives more comfortable. And poultry has been on the rise. Poultry's gone through the roof in terms of production and demand too, as sub-Saharan Africa, as Asia, all these countries have gotten wealthier. So first and foremost, I think just watching communities tap into that resource and supporting them where needed has been really transformative for them. In terms of the crops, our emphasis is on healthy, nutritious food for all. And when we start from the baseline, I'll give you an example. I was in Benin, and it's a really beautiful place. Benin is one of the poorer countries in the world. It's in a very remote area. And one of the villages, we have something called the epicenter strategy, where about 5,000 to 15,000 people can get access to resources, but they're in control. They decide how they want to move forward. And so I went to this village, and there were these women, and they were new moms, and they all have babies, and they're coming and they're weighing their babies. It's a really simple scale hanging from a tree and in a cloth bag. And the women would bring their babies forward, put them on the scale, and they had a simple laminated chart, and they'd be able to see their baby's birth weight and chart it to say, okay, this baby is underweight. And there was, 3 zones to the chart: green, babies of healthy weight; yellow, in the middle; red, danger. So these women were able to kind of look at this very simple information, which to you and I is rudimentary, but they never had access to this before. Like for hundreds of years, they've had malnutrition and child mortality has been very high here. Now they have information at their fingertips. They know if their baby's in the red zone, they got to get some oral rehydration salts. They got to get that baby to a clinic several miles away, which they will do. If it's in the yellow zone, that's where we look for these nutritional supplements and to make sure the baby has the right micronutrients. And they are working with their peers. Their peers understand this, and they're able to get vegetables, some foraged, some leafy greens are foraged, and others are grown nearby. And so they've been able to cultivate those plants, and it's had a significant impact on child mortality and malnutrition for those first 1,000 days. All driven by themselves. This is not an big outside intervention. It's them doing it themselves. So the exciting thing about it is that you can come back in 10 years, they'll still be doing it. You can go to another village and help the next village figure it out, and it stays.
That's wonderful to hear, and I think it goes back to very much the whole local food production, and which breaks down that dependence on food that's produced thousands of miles away.
Yes, absolutely. And you know what? There's almost 1 billion people we can work with like that around the world. It's a huge number of people. So getting governments to adopt this kind of system is another big focus we have. We just want to see, okay, maybe it's not going to solve all the problems of the food system, right? But that, in combination with other policies, in combination with other efforts to reform our food systems, will go a long way to save lives.
So frequently, the flow of ideas and information or advice or expertise moves from the Western world to the global South. From my experience, there's equally interesting things that can flow in the other direction. What do you think, from your experience, the lessons the West can learn from
oh my gosh, yes,
various different food systems is?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, I may have the numbers wrong on this, but there are something like 14,000 varieties of corn. And most of those varieties are grown on indigenous lands. And we only work with like a handful of varieties. And we're obsessed with like just getting the perfect food. And the biodiversity that's out there in the world, still, a lot of it rests in indigenous lands. So you can go, you know, wherever you go in the world, you just go to the mountains, go to where there are less people. Not only can you find varieties you've not encountered before that are more resilient, that don't need all the chemical fertilizers and whatnot on it, but you'll also find what's called wild relatives. And these are plants that are not food yet, but they are similar genetically to food. All of this resource, and corn is just one example. You can look at a dozen crops this way and say, we just know a fraction of the types of apples that are out there. I can name probably a dozen types of apples. Together, you and I could probably get to 20. There's like, right, there are like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of types of apples. And it's fun when you go back and you read some of these old agricultural catalogs and whatnot, and you look up like types of chickens that were for sale, you know, and you just see all these names of chicken. We only know like 2 varieties of chickens. We've just taken we've taken this enormous bounty, this enormous natural bounty, and just whittled it down to a few highly efficient varieties. But when the climate changes and we want to better understand how we can grow food in harmony with our environment, we have to look at this wealth of biodiverse resources that are out there while they're still there, because frankly, we're encroaching on that land every day, and they're going away. A lot of these biodiverse resources are going away. There are a few groups out there that are working to preserve as much as possible these different biodiverse resources. But yeah, I think that's an incredible resource. We work in the highlands of Oaxaca in Mexico, and the people there, they're looking at healthy, nutritious food for their community, and what they see in the Mexican government guidelines, they look at the balance of carbohydrate and meat and this, and then just like the FDA does, the Mexican government does their own, and they say this is nonsense. We can't get most of these foods up here. This doesn't apply to us. So we worked with them, and they wanted to make their own nutritional guidelines. And they did. They came up with their own nutritional plate. And there's a lot of wisdom there. There's a deep understanding of the land, of what it produces naturally, and how to interact with that land. So I think there's just a ton we can learn from indigenous communities elsewhere. I mentioned teff and fonio and millet and sorghum. I mean, there's my grandparents grew sorghum here in the States. Nobody seems to grow sorghum anymore. I think it's grown a little bit in Texas for fuel and maybe some animal feed, but sorghum's kind of out of fashion. Millet's out of fashion. Fonio, gosh, I saw fonio in Whole Foods, made me laugh. I couldn't believe it. But some of these old African crops are really quite cool in terms of how they come out of the ground, and what soil resources they need, and what nutrients they're giving off. And they're much better. Most of them are sorghum, probably not, but fonio and teff, and then some of the other West African grains are much better than corn or wheat. The main problem, though, is if you go to Senegal and you say, okay, you're going to grow fonio or you're going to grow maize or corn, and they'll say, oh, we want to grow the corn because we're going to get a profit off of that. Mm. And so how do you fault a farmer that wants the income for their family? Because that income creates resilience on its own, right?
Yeah, for
sure. We have rising. So it's a conundrum, to say the least. And then you say, okay, why are corn and soy in such high demand? It's animal feed. It's the growing demand for animal products that requires us to just keep growing corn and soy and corn and soy. Yeah, so we're kind of in this loop of just consumption, that's just requiring more and more every year. For the first time, I'm kind of rambling on. You should stop me, by the way. But for the first time, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, Brazil exported just as much soy to China as the United States. And this is, I mean, the tonnage of, I don't mean to point the finger at China for overconsumption per capita. I mean, the US is consuming so much more per capita in terms of resources. As China's economy comes up and they all eat just a little bit more meat, it's a lot more grains and soya that it takes to feed the animals, to feed the people. So there's just a groundswell of demand for corn and soya worldwide. So how you convince a farmer to grow a less profitable crop beats me. I mean, it's tough work, but there's got to be the government policies behind it.
But that comes back to, I guess, what society sees as valuable. And I think from something you said about this focus on efficiency. So let's take one or two varieties of corn or one or two varieties of chicken or cow, and just go and revolve on this efficiency, which we've achieved. We've smashed it out of the park. Mm-hmm. But the question is that the right objective? Or is that the objective that's going to be sustainable long term? And is it our objectives that you think may need some tweaking?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. There's got to be a rebalancing or a reprioritization of how we how we grow food, what kind of food we grow. Ethiopia was interesting because I was asking our staff and even some farmers about this, like, why grow teff? Why would you grow teff if you can grow maize? And in Ethiopia, of course, everybody eats teff. Everybody eats it all the time. So I think the price differential isn't as much. Fundamental here is that everybody's eating it. Demand is there.
But there's an interesting argument there, because if you look at the European diet, the Italian diet, say, what does everyone say Italians? It's all about the tomatoes.
Yeah.
But they're originally from South America.
Yeah.
So we can change.
Definitely. Yeah, I think, and the quantities of food, and there's so many things that we could change about our diet to make this planet. I mean, just switching to plant-based diet, we all know it. You change over to plant-based diet, you just do a remarkable service to the planet. And like, again, in Ethiopia, I mean, I don't know what the total, I want to say about half the year they eat vegan from the church, at least the Orthodox Ethiopians. They're always on some kind of a fast. Look at India, vegetarianism in India. I think the Chinese diet too, as it evolved, there was just a little bit of pork in that diet. It's not a lot. It's mostly vegetables.
Back to on that note, and if you think of more of a medieval type farming system, where you had your garden with your vegetables and those sorts of things. You had a few fields where you grew some grain. You had some cattle or sheep or goats that grazed in and around, got rid of the weeds. The chickens cleaned up all the mess. If you had some dairy animals, you fed the whey to the pigs and kept the curds for cheese. So you had these natural recycling. The animals in those systems were essentially the recyclers.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Where do you see that fitting into things?
The circularity of it, the recycling function. Yeah. Well, this might be a little off topic. It's less about farming and more about food systems, but I'll go for it. I mean, every McDonald's here in the States has an oil dumpster. They can only use, I don't know all the rules, but you can only fry the French fries so many times you have to change the oil. And so they dump the oil in these big bins out back. And then at some point, a big truck comes by and gets the oil. And that oil gets converted to biodiesel. And that's a huge amount of oil. If you think about all the McDonald's all across the States, that's a huge number of oil. Sadly, when we look at our food systems, I think the estimate is 30 to 40% of food is wasted. And there are so few systems like that one with biodiesel. The biodiesel is valuable enough to do that, but mostly the food scraps aren't valuable enough. So it just goes into landfill. But I think we need more systems like that, needless to say. Some of it is about understanding and better working with the perishable dates. If you go into a supermarket in the States, you've got a sell-by date, or you got a best before date, or you have expiration date. Like, there's no standard for when things actually go. These are merely suggestions.
Yeah. And
for quality control and to avoid risk of lawsuit or whatnot, they'll take it off the shelves and they'll dump it. And most big grocery chains do not want to give away that food because they're afraid they're going to get sued. And yet there's been not a single lawsuit for that, for getting sick off of spoiled food in the US, believe it or not. So we just have to better understand and work with systems to take our excess food, give it away in a timely way, move it to somebody who needs it, or dispose of it in a way that's with those. We don't have circularity in the food system at all right now. other than the few examples of like the oil. And so we certainly need to do that. I think even the big commercial farms, they're not designed to work with circularity. That regenerative farm where, the manure is used, like you said, there's a circularity there that is in harmony with the earth. And otherwise you have huge amounts of waste.
I'm guessing that the farm you mentioned earlier, I think it was in Uganda, would have had that circularity.
100%. She had some animals around. The manure was brought out to the fields. Absolutely. And the pumpkin rind, she's not eating those. So those are going to go into the compost. The compost is going to go on the crops. Absolutely.
Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to add?
I think if there could be one change to our food systems, I think we have to figure out a way to subsidize the production of healthy, nutritious food that's grown in a regenerative way. We've only started to scratch the surface of that. In spite of all we know about this subject, we keep subsidizing grains to this massive level. And it's not good enough. It's just simply not good enough for people and planet. We've got to do better.
Tim, it has been an absolute pleasure. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I listened to one other episode. I can't wait to listen to more of your podcast. It's a really cool thing you're doing. So thanks for having me on here. And look forward to hearing more.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Tim Prewitt from The Hunger Project, recorded in California in June 2022.